Great. So Michel is an attorney by training and works in a pro bono advocacy capacity with a number of environmental groups in New York and serves on the board of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, an industry watchdog organization based in the Washington, D.C. area. She's a member of the Nuclear Consulting Group, an international interdisciplinary, think tank, which focuses on a wide variety of issues which intersect with nuclear matters, including public health, safety, and security. Welcome, Michel.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Okay, it's getting late, so let's dig in. So when I was thinking about this issue, really occurred to me, why does it matter? There are so many different environmental issues you can fight against. And this is what I think really is the organizing principles, at least for me. So why does it matter? It matters because a clean river is a right. It matters because dilution is not the solution to pollution. And it matters because our beautiful Hudson River and local communities have been dumped on enough. So let me, first of all, emphasize the first point. This is a rights-based argument. So we can quibble like all day about levels of toxicity and how much harms who or what, but at a certain level, it's beyond the point. It's besides the point. Context is also relevant here. Holtec took over Indian Point, and it took over a $2.4 billion decommissioning trust fund that was paid into by New York ratepayers. The money that was left over from decommissioning and cleanup was supposed to go back to New Yorkers. But when Holtec took it over, and with the okay of the NRC, the business model of Holtec is to do as, frankly, fast and cheap, and arguably dirty a decommissioning as possible and pocket whatever is left over. So that's their profit model, being able to have money from that fund left over. And where there is a difference between all the radionuclides that went into the river while Indian Point was operating and now is that there's no public benefit to having more radionuclides and other contaminants dumped into the Hudson River, right? You could at least make an arguable claim that while the plant was operating, there was no other option. Nuclear plants that operate have to be releasing radioactivity continually into the air, into the water, into the soil. That's part of the operation. But you can say, well, at least we get power from it. Whereas that's not the case with a shut plant. So when you're looking at cost benefit, all the cost would be borne by New Yorkers and, of course, our river. And all the benefit of dumping it into the river would go to Holtec. And basically, from a public policy perspective, I think that's a very raw deal for New Yorkers. So can we go to the slide with the, okay, so this is interesting. When you're thinking about the river, and when you're thinking about adding more detrimental impacts into it, you really have to understand that a river is a living ecosystem, right? So this is actually a river. It was originally done by Riverkeeper. It's a thermal photo of the heat plume at the top that was emitted by Indian Point into the river while the plant was operating. And at the bottom plume on the left was a shut coal plant. But you can see that just the heat alone as it impacted this river tremendously. And that was actually one of the contentions New York filed when it went to a battle against the relicensing of the plant. Um, one of the problems in this whole area is that the contamination itself is invisible, right? So there are very few visuals that you have. That's one reason I wanted to show this. I'll have another one later, unless it's up to the next slide. I'm not sure where you, Rebecca, okay, we'll save the other one for later. But the whole issue of dilution being the solution to pollution drives me absolutely nuts. Because the premise is basically, okay, we can incrementally poison the river as long as we do it in little bits, and then it washes all over and it just vanishes. Well, that doesn't happen with many of the radionuclides. Many of these radionuclides, not tritium, which the tritium it has a half-life of 12 years, which means it has a full radioactivity life of about over a century. But there are many other radionuclides that would be, that have been and potentially would be added in this wastewater. We don't know what they are yet because they haven't been characterized. But when you think of the overall health of the river and the idea of dilution being the solution, right? So that's why we have Hudson that's choking with microplastics. It's why we have rivers awash with PFAs, and it's why the Hudson River is a 200-mile Superfund site. Because over the years, decades ago, when General Electric was putting in its, throwing PCBs into the river, everybody just thought, oh, the volume of water is just going to dilute it. It's no big deal, right? So this, going back to with the release we're talking about today, this is an opportunity to stop and to fight against a release that is irreparable. You can't take it back. Once the tritium and the other radionuclides are released into the river, that's it. It's a done deal. So that's why I think this is actually a good place to draw a line in the sand and basically say no. So first, next slide. I'm going to go through this slide really fast and just point out a couple of things. So these are just 4 studies that are fairly recent, talking about the issue of radionuclides in water. So the first one was Rapina, was a Woods Hole study that was done last year for the Pilgrim community, who are up in arms about, or actually from the Plymouth community that in Massachusetts, that is up in arms about the release of contaminated water into Cape Cod Bay. So basically, this study basically just estimated where the currents would go and the tides based on wind, and it went through 30 years of data, and basically said, some of it's going to enter Cape Cod Bay. So obviously this is something that the community there, fishermen and so forth, are strongly objecting to. The second one I just thought was fascinating. This was a study done some years ago, and they were trying to compare or identify where radionuclides were in the Hudson River from different sources, because there is a Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory that was in the Mohawk River that actually emptied into the Hudson. So they were able to trace some of the radionuclides from the corals. But when they looked also at the radionuclides from Indian Point, and they were only looking at cesium-137, one of the things they found was this cesium-137 in the sediments 18 miles downstream of Indian Point's location. So that just really illustrates what should be an obvious fact, which is the water in this river. It's a tidal estuary. It goes up, it goes down. And you really don't know exactly where the radionuclides are going to end up But as was found by the Rapina study, there's a reasonable assumption it's going to be going near the shoreline and possibly aggregating in organically bound tritium in sediment by the shore where people recreate and fish and swim and so forth. I'll skip over Bonadera right now just for time. Makajani, one thing that's sort of funky about tritium is it has exceptionally high molecular exchange rate with hydrogen atoms. And so that makes it very mobile in the environment. And it disperses in this really weird way where this is unique to tritium, where atoms that aren't radioactive can become radioactive based on their proximity to the tritium molecules. So this is a study that came out, actually it's a monograph that came out earlier this year by Arjun Makajani, who's a chemist who's done a lot of study of radionuclides over the years. And he notes that for a given mass, tritium is about 150,000 times as radioactive in terms of disintegration as plutonium, which is an extremely toxic radionuclide. And this is something I didn't know until I read his monograph, is a teaspoon of tritiated water as H2O, which is one of the forms tritium can take, would contaminate about 100 billion gallons of water to the US drinking water limit, which, by the way, is 20,000 picocuries per liter. So next slide. So National Academies report. This came out last year. Long name as much of these studies are, leveraging advances in modern science to revitalize low-dose radiation research in the United States. So key acknowledgement in this study, which most of us knew, but now it's stated authoritatively for the record, is that the NRC regulations are basically based on 1970s era science. And so let me just give a little bit of background about 1970 era science. It's really based on 1960s and 1950s research. And the entire sort of regulatory scheme globally, but in the United States, is essentially based on what came out of the Manhattan Project when health physics discipline was born. And what was looked at the time, as you would think, understandably from the Manhattan Project scientists that they were thinking of protecting, was they were looking at, how much can you expose a man who is 20 to 30 years old, weighs 154 pounds, is Caucasian. So that obviously doesn't apply to the most vulnerable people that are in our society. And what the National Academies study also noted is that the whole regulatory scheme only looks pretty much at cancer, which of course is absolutely hideous risk of exposure to radiation. And that goes under what's called the no threshold standard. It's basically there's no level of radioactivity exposure that couldn't potentially cause cancer. So that standard is pretty well accepted, and we're certainly not going to object to it. But the problem is, as acknowledged by the National Academies, is there are a lot of other diseases and health conditions besides cancer. And many of these actually are more likely to be caused by exposures to low level and low doses of radiation, which is what the US population is more likely to be exposed to, right? Let's just go to the ethics issue. So we're talking about cumulative impacts. And the Peak School area community is an environmental justice community. And that's why the point made before, not only is it enough of radioactivity and other pollutants dumped into the Hudson, but it's really enough dumped on this community. So they have a whole slew of different, it used to be it's an old industrial area. And one of the most really pernicious industries in the area is this wheelabrator. That is an incinerator that burns all of the waste of Westchester County. So that is basically continually being pumped into the air and into the Hudson River. So when you're thinking of what the actual health impacts are in actually human beings and in the aquatic system, you really have to take into consideration the entirety of the burden. So now we have this is actually a NRC visual, and this came out of the leaks, the legacy leaks at Indian Point. Again, you have to be thinking of what the cumulative impacts of radioactivity are, and of all the other chemicals and other toxins that have been pumped into this river from Indian Point and other sites in the area and up and down the river. So this was after they discovered that there were these leaks from the spent fuel pools under the site. This is essentially two different plumes. At the time, it was both tritium and strontium that had been leaking unknown to anybody until it was discovered. And some of the leaks were gone on for years and years from the spent fuel pools, from the Indian Point Unit 1 and Unit 2 spent fuel pools. And those legacy leaks are still going into the Hudson River, and they're going into the groundwater of the area. It should be mentioned also that there are many, many buried pipes at the Indian Point site that carried water that was radioactive. And as these pipes age, and some of them are going to be left after decommissioning, you're likely to have a lot more contamination coming out of these pipes and leaching into the soil and the groundwater and ultimately into the river. So that basically sums up what I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle.